In the 1980s, right after a brutal civil war and unrest that lasted for 15 years, Zimbabwe was on the brink of becoming an overnight African success. The country had just broken free from the shackles of colonialism, and even though a civil war had almost torn the country apart, they had bounced back and soon became one of the likeliest African countries to achieve total economic reform. But over 40 years later, this country never quite became what we all thought it would. In fact, it became the exact opposite 1,000 times over. This forces us to ask, what really happened to Zimbabwe? How did such a promising country go from being at the top of the world, only to become one of the poorest countries in the world? Let's find out together. Before Zimbabwe ever existed, this country was called Southern Rhodesia, and it was a large area of land where various tribal communities lived and thrived for years. However, in the 1890s, the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes drew a long line across the map of Africa, and this country was born. The Africans naturally hated the leadership of the colonialists, and even though they were heavily silenced and criticized, they fought for their independence. Finally, after several years of being directly under the UK, Zimbabwe achieved their independence. But rather than this being a positive development, it quickly turned into one of the worst periods for the country. In 1964, an intense civil war broke out in the country, and this war would last for a total of 15 years, 1979 towards early 1980. Like every other war, it took the lives of thousands of Zimbabweans, destroyed a ton of the country's infrastructure, and put a promising country right at the edge of collapse. But something very interesting happened right after the war. For a moment, it seemed like the sun was shining on the people of Zimbabwe. To the shock of the entire world, the country slowly began building itself back up. And in an interesting and fortunate twist, its GDP grew by 5.2% in 10 years. And this was the trick that the leaders, primarily Robert Mugabe, employed. The country focused exclusively on public spending programs, and this included spending on education and healthcare facilities. This spending program was not a waste of funds or an aimless attempt at rebuilding. It was in fact a project that aimed to expose more of its citizens to education, while also offering them quality healthcare. And this trick turned out to be a butter-smooth operation, as more families began enrolling their kids in schools, and the state of education reached an enviable quality. At this point, the entire world was watching, and everyone naturally believed that this country was on its way to become one of the greatest in Africa, and its economy was dubbed the most promising in Africa. But despite the promising nature of this country's future, its leader, Robert Mugabe, was going to make a series of errors, which didn't just sink the country into total chaos, but also sort of provided a template for future leaders on how not to run a country. Lesson 1. Make an effort to understand how government works. Why would anyone with no knowledge of how the government works ever want to be president? Well, Robert Mugabe wasn't exactly a novice when it came to understanding the political landscape, but his expertise didn't stop him from making costly mistakes. Building new and improved infrastructure did improve the quality of life for the people of Zimbabwe. But if you built something really good, you would naturally spend a lot of money maintaining it. This meant that the country spent so much money on not just building these structures, but also on maintaining them, eventually resulting in the country going broke. I mean, it was so bad that the entire country didn't have money in its emergency funds account. Despite this looming financial crisis, the country still managed to stay afloat and fool its citizens to the point that a major percentage of the country had no idea that things were that bad. Well, until 1998. Lesson 2. Mind your business. In 1998, the country made the terrible decision to get involved in the war happening in Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. Now we have to understand that these two neighboring countries have shared a close tie for some time, and it seemed right that Zimbabwe would intervene. If Zimbabwe had decided against fighting in this war, it would be the same with you choosing not to fight side by side with your best friend. But on the flip side, this wasn't the right move for Zimbabwe for a ton of reasons. For starters, the country was running without emergency funds, and they now had to spend money on an avoidable war. During this time, the country had survived by receiving funds from the World Bank and the IMF, but it was only a matter of time before this supply got cut off. The next year, the World Bank and the IMF decided that they could no longer fund Zimbabwe's effort in the war, forcing the country to spend from its own pocket, which was practically empty at this point. But the final nail in the coffin will eventually come in 2002 when the country was suspended from the Commonwealth due to allegations of corruption. And as terrible as that was, it wasn't the end of the road for the Zimbabweans. Immediately after this suspension, the US and EU placed the country on several sanctions, including a ban on imported Zimbabwean products, which primarily focused on the country's agricultural produce, since the agriculture represented over 12% of the country's GDP. The fact that they could no longer be exported instantly threw the country deeper into the economic crisis that had been brewing. From this point, everything began to just go on a downward spiral. In 2006, the rate of inflation reached an insane 1,000%, and the country got the least enviable award for being the world's fastest shrinking economy. Just 2 years later, the country's leaders admitted that the inflation rate had reached 1,000,000%, but as crazy as this figure sounded, it wasn't true. According to a Bloomberg report that came out the same year, the country's inflation rate had reached 500 billion%, the highest any country in the world has ever had to deal with. The stats on paper were terrible, but the reality of the Zimbabwean people was 1,000 times scarier. The streets became filled with beggars and hungry citizens. Crime reached its peak. Jobs became impossible to find. The general quality of life dropped, and the country continued its descent into destruction. The country's economic crisis has also led to a money problem. Today, Zimbabwe's highest currency denomination is 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. This should at least be equal to $1,000, right? Well, 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars converts to just about 40 cents. Yes, you heard that right. Rather than tackle the underlying causes of the inflation, the country responded by printing more and more banknotes until the money lost its entire value. Now, even though this country has been sinking into this bottomless economic abyss, it doesn't look like they'd be getting out of it soon. Countries have refused to lend them cash because they really have no way of repaying. The people live in extreme poverty because of an unemployment rate of over 90%, one of the highest in the entire world. Zimbabwe's rise and dramatic fall has been nothing short of bad leadership, both in general and economic terms, an obsession with corruption, and recent signs suggest that this will go on for a long time. What measures do you think Zimbabwe can adopt to improve their economy and the lives of their citizens? Or do you think this African country is doomed forever? We'd like to hear from you in the comments section. Is this your first time around here? Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss educational and fun videos like this one. If you learned something new in this video, let us know by hitting the like button. See you next time.